Hello and welcome to Western Civ, episode 282, The New Josiah. As I mentioned last time, Henry VIII's death would usher in a new period of English history. While Henry may have started the English Reformation, his son and his son's supporters would finish it. Under Henry, the Reformation proceeded in fits and starts. Henry's desire to break with Rome was never driven out of true religious conviction, but out of a desire to secure the succession with a new wife. Henry maintained many Catholic practices that were still anathema to Protestants and evangelicals. Today, we will begin to see how life would change under the young Edward, and critically, the men who ruled in his name. Henry's body lay in state for 10 days. From there, it was transferred to Windsor, where on the 15th of February, 1547, one of England's most impactful kings was laid to rest. That night, the lords surrounding Edward hastened back to London. There were more important ceremonies to prepare for. The next day, these men, around Paget and Seymour, gathered in the Tower of London, where they all received their rewards for agreeing to Seymour's place as protector. Seymour himself was elevated to become Duke of Somerset, which is how he will be referred to from here on out. Dudley and Wriothesley became the Earls of Warwick and Southampton, and Catherine's brother, William Parr, the Marquess of Northampton. There were peerages for Sir Thomas Seymour, Sir Richard Rich, Sir William Willoughby, and Sir Edmund Sheffield. At the same time, Dudley was granted the staff of Great Chamberlain, while Thomas Seymour replaced Dudley in his former office of Lord Admiral. To finish the day, Edward attended his first chapter of the Order of the Garter. On Saturday, the 19th of February, the day before his coronation, Edward made his procession from the Tower of London toward Westminster. It was to be the main occasion for Edward to be shown off to his people, and for his subjects to catch a glimpse of their new king. Crowds gathered along swept and freshly graveled streets as Edward left the tower at around 1 o'clock, riding on horseback and dressed in a vivid white jerkin of velvet, to make sure he was easily recognizable amongst the mass of thronging people. His gown was a fine mesh of gold with a cape of sable, while the horse he rode upon was draped in crimson satin and beaded with pearls. By now, preparations for Edward's coronation had begun in earnest. On the 4th of February, a proclamation had been issued demanding, quote, all the nobility and other subjects claiming to do service, end quote, at the coronation should make their claims to a court at Whitehall. On the 7th of February, these were debated among the council. Many of the ancient nobility expected to perform tasks at the coronation that they had always performed, that their ancestors before them had performed. The Earl of Shrewsbury, for example, was to provide the king's right-hand glove and support his hand while he held the scepter. The Earl of Oxford, as Great Chamberlain, to serve the king water in order to wash his hands and face before the coronation, while the Earl of Arundel, the nobleman with the oldest lineage of all the lords, was to act as chief butler at the coronation feast. The reward for such service was more than just honor. Arundel would be given all the wine left in the barrels afterward, in addition to the best cup served to the king. Oxford would be given the silver basins and towels once Edward was finished with them. The officers at Westminster Abbey received 100 loaves of bread and 88 gallons of wine. At 9 in the morning, Edward was taken by barge to Whitehall. At Westminster Abbey, he appeared before the representatives of his kingdom. Cranmer read the first part of the coronation aloud to the three estates gathered. Each time those present were required to swear in some way or another to uphold Edward's rule and authority so long as he lived. To each pronouncement the audience replied, perhaps a bit mechanically, quote, "Yea, yea, yea, God save King Edward," end quote. There was something new here, however. Cranmer cleverly tipped his hand a bit when he decreed that church reform now came from the crown directly, not from the people. The people, not the king, had to consent to new laws. Cranmer explained these changes in a sermon he provided thereafter. He addressed the king. The oaths given, he told him, were not to be, quote, taken in the Bishop of Rome's sense, end quote. The clergy had absolutely no right whatsoever to hold English kings to account. The archbishops of Canterbury had crowned Edward's predecessors, but once God's anointed, they had no right to reject them. Indeed, the coronation ceremony itself had no hold over Edward, who could act as however he wished. Nevertheless, Cranmer reminded Edward that God required from kings and rulers, quote, religion and virtue, end quote. He was a messenger from the Savior Jesus Christ, and he reminded Edward of his princely duty with a direct comparison from the Old Testament. Quote, "Your Majesty is God's vice-regent and God's vicar within your own dominions, and to see with your predecessor Josiah, God truly worshipped, and idolatry destroyed. The tyranny of the bishops of Rome banished from your subjects, and images removed. These acts be signs of a second Josiah, who reformed the church of God in his days. You are to reward virtue, to avenge sin, to justify the innocent, to relieve the poor, to procure peace, to repress violence, and to execute justice through your realms. For precedents on those kings who performed not these things, the old law shows how the Lord avenged his quarrel. And on those kings who fulfilled these things, he poured forth his blessings in abundance. For example, it is written of Josiah in the book of Kings thus, like unto him there was no king before him that turned to the Lord with all his heart, according to the law of Moses, neither after him arose there any like him. This was to that prince a perpetual fame of dignity to remain to the end of his days." End quote. This image of Edward as a second Josiah, a reforming Josiah, was very powerful, and it was one that those around Edward would cite frequently during his reign. It was an expression both of Edward's supremacy, of course, but also the critical mission that lay before him. The genesis of Cranmer's argument had already been expressed in a royal proclamation issued previously on the 31st of January. This declared that Edward had come to the throne, quote, fully invested and established in the crown imperial of his realm, end quote. Technically, Cranmer was arguing, there was no further recognition or legal action required to confirm his authority. A striking coronation medal, produced in gold and silver, also reflected this idea, showing the young king clad in armor and girded with the sword of faith. Inscriptions on the opposite side in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew all stress Edward's supremacy over his realm and the church therein. What all this amounted to was a powerful message. Edward was not going to be like any other English king that had gone before him. He was the first king to be born with the title Defender of the Faith, the first to be crowned with the powers that the royal supremacy brought with it. No king, before or since, was ever given such an unequivocal mandate for rule. Aside all this religious messages, there were, of course, the usual trappings of a coronation. Over the following 2 days, there were royal jousts. Edward watched from the galleys. 6 challengers, including his uncle Thomas Seymour, ran 6 courses against 12 defenders, and an extra 2 for their ladies. The banqueting continued, together with another play. This one was about Orpheus. Everyone seemed very impressed, except for the imperial ambassador, so the ambassador to Charles V, Vander Delft, who, despite not having been invited to attend the coronation banquet, complained that the entertainments were unremarkable. He had heard that other ambassadors were not treated satisfactorily and had found it difficult to find a seat in the confusion. What Edward thought of the occasion, his diary entry reveals little. Recalling the ceremonies that encircled him, he merely remarked that he sat next to his uncle and Cranmer, quote, with the crown on his head, end quote. At this point, it was clear that Somerset and Paget had won the game. They had dictated the terms of the transfer of power, and their supporters had been rewarded. Even Charles V's ambassador recognized how Somerset governs, quote, everything absolutely, end quote, acting only on Paget's advice and counsel. Oddly enough, however, Somerset's legal authority remained poorly defined. There was no legal or constitutional justification for the protectorate. It had just kind of come into being because those in the Privy Council had accepted it, most of them having been bribed. But there were some cracks already forming in the evangelical faction. The same imperial ambassador who had been so impressed by Somerset's authority noted that Lord Dudley was already growing jealous of the Lord Protector's authority. For the moment, however, Somerset's attention was drawn elsewhere, toward the Lord Chancellor Wriothesley. For though he had agreed to support the Protectorate, the imperial ambassador considered that Wriothesley had done so out of fear, perhaps believing that Somerset's ambitions could be reined in. The Earl would later tell this same ambassador he would resist any further changes that went beyond the provisions set out in Henry's will, claiming that he had prevented Somerset from gaining even further powers. And despite his reward of an earldom, Wriothesley seems to have been determined to resist Somerset's further plans for advancement. As Chancellor, Wriothesley was the keeper of the Great Seal. This needed to be affixed to every patent for its authentication, giving him, in effect, a veto on each royal patent and commission. This point was never lost on Somerset. Wriothesley would need to be dismissed if he hoped to further establish his powers as Lord Protector. And by the way, he didn't wait long to seize the opportunity. In fact, Wriothesley played straight into Somerset's hands. 2 days before the coronation, he had commissioned 4 civil lawyers to hear cases in his absence in order to concentrate upon his business in council, importantly, without the new king's warrant. A team of common lawyers declared this action to be, quote, the great hindrance, prejudice, and decay of said common laws, end quote, demanding as well that Wriothesley be removed from his position as Chancellor. The council, examining the charge, felt that they could not pass judgment. This, at least, was the case according to a draft of the proceedings. However, when the final version of the indictment was copied into the Privy Council register, this fact was curiously omitted. Wriothesley was charged on the 5th of March. While under examination, the final indictment read, quote, he had not only menaced drivers of said learned law, but he had also used unfitting words to me, the said protector, to the prejudice of the king's estates, and the hindrance of his majesty's reign. What danger might ensue if the great seal of England, whereby the king and realm might be bound, should continue in the hands of so stout and arrogant a person as durst presume at his will to seal without a warrant. End quote. The upshot of all of this, the Great Seal was taken from Wriothesley's hands, and he was placed under house arrest. Hence, even those of the conservative faction which had initially joined with Somerset were bitterly disappointed now by Wriothesley's fall. But before they could do anything about it, Somerset acted again. Somerset had the most important among them, including the powerful Bishop Stephen Gardiner, confined to their homes and watched. Wriothesley found himself detained in London, likely to prevent him from meeting up with Gardiner. Meanwhile, Somerset moved to consolidate his power. On March the 1st, 1547, the executors of Henry's will, the almost certainly forged will, were amalgamated to create a single privy council. On March the 12th, these men requested a new commission, granting the board full authority during Edward's minority. As a result of all this, Somerset got huge new powers. He could now add or remove councillors, convene the council whenever he wanted, and even if he chose, act without its approval. In effect, Somerset had become de facto king. Indeed, it was not long before Somerset started to behave like one. He granted himself an annuity of £8,000 per year. When he wrote to Francis I, he addressed the French king as brother, as English monarchs are wont to do. Now Francis rebuked him for that slight and quickly reminded him who he was. Then, that summer, he had the family arms changed to resemble the royal ones. By May of 1547, the imperial ambassador wrote to Charles V that Somerset was now basically king. All state business was conducted at his home. Soon, Somerset would be controlling the entire English government by himself. He even signed official warrants on Edward's behalf. This wasn't without surprise. Regencies are always opportunities for ambitious men to step in and seize control. In fact, during the last days of Henry's life, a conservative preacher preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, hinting at the troubles to come if a boy king came to the throne. Quote, "What a world it shall be when they shall have the rule, for if they have the swing it would be treason shortly to worship God." End quote. This conservative and ominous message would have struck a chord with everyone in the audience. For 38 years, the country had been dominated by Henry VIII. Few honestly could remember a time before. Now, no one knew quite what to expect. But this preacher was proved right. The world would be a very different place very soon. Henry's death had removed the greatest obstacle to further unimpeded reform of the church. But when he was urged to press on with the Reformation, Cranmer was already worried about the speed at which events had begun to progress. Under Henry, saints' images had been condemned, but they had been allowed to stand, provided that they were not the focus of the worship. For religious evangelicals, opposed to any form of religious imagery, this did not go far enough. They wanted them smashed and broken up, so that there would be no distraction from observing the true Word of God as set down in Scripture. Even before Henry's body had been laid in the grave, the parishioners of the city church of St. Martin in London had ripped out their church interior, replacing these figures with royal arms, saints' images with biblical text, declaring, quote, "Thou shalt make no graven images, lest thou worship them," end quote. Now examined by the council, these same people alleged that the roof was in need of repair. The crucifix and images, quote, being so old, they were so rotten that they fell to powder, end quote. Now, at the time, they received reprimand for this arrogance, but only because they had taken this action before they had gotten royal approval. But now, according again to our imperial ambassador, who's a great chronicler of the events of Edward's reign, by the way, events started to take a turn. Now the evangelicals were unrestrained. Quote, the people are beginning to adhere strongly to the sects, end quote. And the council started to order evangelical preachers to give daily sermons before Edward at court, where they seemed to vie with each other about who could just simply heap more abuse on the old Catholic Church. On Ash Wednesday, one such preacher denounced the images of saints, and others quickly followed. There were plays condemning Lent performed before Edward all the time, provoking protests from Stephen Gardiner to the council. He wrote, Lent remaineth still, my lord, and shall, God willing. Somerset replied to this, somewhat sarcastically. He wrote that he was so earnestly addicted to the new faith that he was perfectly content for the reformers to continue their attacks. Historians today still very much debate the nature of Somerset's own religious beliefs. Certainly, he was a patron of several Protestant ministers, which suggests that he was more than a moderate reformer. But beyond that, honestly, there is little evidence that he supported major reform. Determining the religious leanings of those who lived hundreds of years before is always a difficult task. This is unfortunate, because Somerset was King Edward's tutor and instructor in the ways of government, and so Somerset's religious beliefs are very relevant. Certainly, for the evangelical faction, Somerset was, quote, bound in conscience to set forth God's lively word, and ordained by God himself to make so godly a ready way in the hearts of all, end quote. God's temple was to be restored. England must become a new Eden. Nothing less would suffice. Still, at least officially for the moment, nothing had changed. Edward continued to hear Mass in his chapel. In fact, on Easter Sunday alone, he heard 4 Catholic Masses. When Francis I died that March, he was mourned in the Catholic fashion in St. Paul's. This, however, would be the last time that Catholic funerary rites would be used in an official state service in England. Sensing the direction the kingdom was moving, Catholics began leaving England in droves, usually heading for France or Italy. Their worst fears were soon confirmed. In June, Somerset announced a royal visitation of the entire kingdom that would begin in July. This was intended to ensure everyone was following the new religious directives. These included the old reforms under Henry, like encouraging the laity to read scripture. But they also included prohibitions on centuries-old practices, like rosary beads, and the use of candles on altars. Even stained glass images of saints were to be destroyed. It was an all-out assault on traditional Catholic practices in England. Nothing was left to discretion anymore. Priests across England had to follow the new rules, or get out. End of story. With Wriothesley destroyed and the Conservatives firmly out of power, Somerset's authority was now unquestioned. The council, owing their places of power to Somerset, effectively worshipped the man. But not everyone was so content to allow Somerset's powers to continue unchecked. Since his disappointment at the council chamber, his brother, Sir Thomas Seymour, had refused to come to terms with his brother's appointment as protector. He wrote once, quote, "Why was he made protector? There is no need of a protector. It was not in the king's will. That dead is that any one who should have both the government of the king and also the realm," end quote. Looking at the chronicles, History showed that in the minority of Henry VI, the offices of protector and governor of the king had been kept separate. Why couldn't he be governor and his brother be protector? So Seymour decided he would try to trot an old path toward power, marriage. He would seek to marry Henry's widow, Catherine Parr. Catherine had dutifully watched Henry's funeral, clad in black, but in reality his death had come as a relief. She was now free to practice her Protestant faith and live as she wished. She soon realized Seymour was interested in her and saw the potential for a new beginning. According to one report, Seymour was making romantic overtures the very day after Henry's death. That's not likely, but the two soon became lovers. Catherine moved into a house in Chelsea, a secluded spot where the two could easily meet. Catherine soon divulged the affair to a friend, Lady Paget, who urged Catherine to marry Seymour without delay. But Catherine, mindful of public opinion, was hesitant. Soon, however, rumors of the affair leaked out. By May or perhaps June, the couple had wed in secret. Catherine was playing a dangerous game by moving so quickly. If she became pregnant, there would be no way of knowing if the baby was Seymour's or the deceased Henry's. Still, Seymour needed allies, and he knew precisely who to turn to. He had maintained regular contact with the young King Edward through a gentleman of the Privy Chamber whom Seymour gave a bribe of about £10. Shortly after the coronation, this man was in his regular pay. Despite being almost continually in the presence of other gentlemen in the chamber, this gentleman was soon able to converse with King Edward directly, and struck up a close relationship with the king, speaking to him alone. It wasn't long before Seymour was calling in favors. At the end of February, he met with this man over a drink and asked whether Edward had mentioned him, and in particular whether the king had ever wondered why he had remained unmarried. Would Edward be happy for him to marry? And who should he take as his bride? Without asking too many questions, this gentleman approached King Edward a few days later, and somewhat unsubtly repeating Seymour's queries. Edward's first reply was to suggest Anne of Cleves, another, of course, of Henry VIII's old wives. But then, giving the matter more serious attention, he answered that he thought Princess Mary would be the best choice. When Seymour heard, he laughed. He said, "I pray you, if you may soon ask his grace, if he would be contented I should marry the queen." He also wanted to know if Edward would write a letter on his behalf in support of this marriage idea. It was shortly after this that Seymour dispensed with the intermediary and began secretly writing to King Edward. The king, seemingly, encouraged the relationship. He appeared also to give Catherine Parr assurances he would protect her, should Somerset turn against this proposed marriage, which he would surely, given that it would increase Seymour's prestige at the protector's expense. And, of course, Lord Somerset did find out. When he did, he was enraged. But so was his wife, Anne. She was the wife of the Lord Protector and demanded that she be given precedence over the Queen. Unfortunately, this rivalry between Catherine Parr and Lord Somerset's wife, Anne, would only increase the animosity between Somerset and his brother. Catherine, to an extent, had reason already to be miffed at Somerset. She probably had expected to be named Edward's regent. She was the closest one to him after all. Though not his biological mother, she had done a lot to raise him. Catherine was not pleased when Somerset was named protector. Making matters worse, when Somerset later demanded that Catherine return the jewels Henry left her in his will, she balked. At first she tried to remain patient, but soon the Duke's behavior proved too much even for her. When Somerset began to grant leases on her dower lands without her prior consent, leasing a park to a gentleman who subsequently refused to grant her any rights to her own property, her temper finally boiled over. She wrote to Seymour, her new husband, quote, "My lord, your brother, hath this afternoon made me a little warm. It was fortunate we were so distant, for I suppose else I should have bitten him." End quote. But for the moment, Somerset's thoughts lay elsewhere. The diplomatic situation remained tense, with England dangerously isolated. In August 1546, William Paget had prepared a memorandum outlining the problem. France would soon want to revenge the loss of Boulogne, recently captured by Henry VIII. The emperor, under the influence of the papacy, to recover its, quote, "usurped power and tyranny over this realm," end quote, could not be trusted. These fears were realized upon the death of Francis I, when the resumption of war with France became all but inevitable, since the new king Henri II was determined to win back Boulogne. His ascension also saw a return to power of the powerful Guise family, who at the same time recovered their strengths in Scotland, where Mary of Guise, the widow of James V and mother of Edward's supposed future bride, Mary, Queen of Scots, gained ascendancy over her rivals and looked to ally her country closer to France. And that is where I want to stop it for the moment. We need to introduce some of the revolutionary changes going on in France, as those will dramatically impact affairs in England. So next week, we turn to France and its new king, Henri II. As always, if you're looking for ways to support the show, check out links in the show notes. I've got a lot of bonus content in there and a new membership feed that's cheaper and it's got a lot more content than the previous one. It's got a 7-day free trial as well, so go ahead and give that link a click if you're so inclined.